addition to the number of shots and the capability of the rifle, it is important to know the time span between shots, since, as we pointed out previously, if the shots were closer together than the rifle could be fired, two rifles must have been involved. So our next question, what was the time span of the shots? The answer might lie in Mr. Zapruder's film of the assassination. You'll recall that the commission decided that the first shot was fired at frame 210 on the Zapruder film, and the last shot at frame 313. Tests of the camera made by the FBI reported that it was running at a speed of 18.3 frames a second. Divide 103 frames by 18.3 frames a second, and you get 5.6 seconds, which is the time the commission reported Oswald probably had to take. It's a point upon which the critics have seized. Could Oswald have fired 3 shots in 5.6 seconds? Well, then new evidence made its appearance. It was the first called to our attention by a distinguished physicist, Dr. Luis Alvarez of the University of California at Berkeley.
What was it that made you interested enough to dip into the Warren report to begin analyzing the photos of that day?
Well, I think it was probably that I had lunch every day with a bunch of my graduate students who were keenly interested in the controversy that was going on at the time. For a while, I couldn't get very interested in it, but then when Life magazine republished the frames from the Zapruder movie, I spent an evening looking at them, and I found something that excited my interest.
What first caught your eye, Dr. Alvarez?
Well, it's right here in the picture. At frame 227, the highlights on the windshield of the car are all drawn out into rather pronounced streaks. And you can see that in the frame ahead, the highlights are individual dots, and again in the frame beyond are individual dots. So something rather violent happened to the line of direction of Mr. Zapruder's camera in frame 227. It swung violently.
If Dr. Alvarez were right, the Zapruder film might contain a record of the number of shots fired. If blurs, which could be accepted as evidence of gunshots, occurred in a certain time span, then the shots themselves would be in the same span. We remind you again that the film is owned by Life magazine and is not available for broadcast. So, CBS News commissioned an expert photo analyst, Charles Wyckoff, of the Massachusetts firm of Edgerton, Germenhausen, and Greer, to make an analysis of the Zapruder film frames. Dan Rather interviewed Mr. Wyckoff.
Mr. Wyckoff, the entire Zapruder film shows the whole assassination?
Yes, it does, Dan. The film was an 8mm motion picture film, and the entire record in which the president was in view was represented on a film about this long, which only took about 10 seconds. And all of the records of interest were on this small piece of film. We actually looked at all the frames, but we only studied certain frames in detail. The reason for studying those frames in detail was the fact that there were certain little things in there that looked blurred at first, and we were quite interested in why they looked blurred. For instance, on frame 190 here, or rather, let's start with frame 189. There's a wall in the background with little holes that you can see a white building through those holes.
Well, that's a tile.
That's a tile wall. And you can see the little holes. If you look at it with a magnifying glass here, you see those are nice and round and fairly sharp. And yet in frame 190, right next to it, you can no longer tell that those holes are circular. They're blurred out.
Now, why is that?
Something must have happened to Mr. Zapruder when he was, something must have startled him when he was holding his camera. He had a camera very much like this model right here, which is an 8mm camera. And as he held it up to his eye, concentrating on the president, something startled him, and he jumped a little bit with the camera.
Not nearly that much.
Not anything like that at all, just a very subtle jump, but that was just enough to cause a blur of these little holes in here, and also a blur of highlights on the car.
All right, now you see that very clearly in frame 190, and that frame does look distorted, and you can't see the white holes in the wall across the street clearly at all. Now, how many times does that occur in this 10-second stretch of 8mm film?
Now, that occurs several times, as we've represented up here on this film on the wall. It occurs at frame 190. It occurs again at frame 227. Frame 227 was the next evidence that I had of Mr. Zapruder moving his camera. and it occurs at frame 318. Now, this is interesting because we all know that at frame 313, the President received the fatal shot. He had a natural reaction time that he heard the sound at about the same time that something happened to President Kennedy when he was fatally wounded here. We can apply this same correction of about 4 or 5 frames to each one of these frames where I notice motion. In other words, I'm saying that it was possible that there could have been a shot fired here, another one fired in this area of 222, 223, and another one in the area of 313, noticeable now in 318. I think the important thing is the fact that we have found an indication some 20 frames prior to the time the Warren Commission thought that the first shot was fired. Now, whether or not this was a shot, we cannot say, but certainly Mr. Zapruder, the photographer, was disturbed at that point.
What does this finding mean to those of us who simply have followed the controversy over the assassination and are not physicists?
Well, to me it means that there were indeed 3 shots fired, as the Commission said, that the one that apparently didn't hit anyone in the car was fired before the one that hit the President, and not between the 2 shots that obviously hit the President.
Just as a rough check on this theory, we decided to try it ourselves, using other cameramen holding similar cameras, standing on a rifle range, filming an automobile while a rifleman fired over their heads. These 2 volunteers are aiming their cameras at a parked limousine. Their instructions: hold the cameras as steady as possible and keep filming no matter what happens. The shots will come between them and the car. The cameramen are as far from the firing platform as Mr. Zapruder was from the 6th floor of the book depository. The reaction was obvious. The film taken by these cameramen showed the effect of the shots, despite instructions to hold steady. Even in steadier hands, motion was always noticeable. This frame shows highlight dots around the car's windshield. In reaction to a shot, the dots change to crescents. And in the following frame, they become streaks, comparable to streaks found on some frames of Mr. Zapruder's film. Incidentally, Dr. Alvarez also suggested that the first shot might still be lodged in the tree. We checked it with a metal detector, but unfortunately it did not reveal any presence of a bullet. Perhaps more sophisticated equipment will be developed in the future to X-ray the tree. Perhaps the most intriguing feature of the entire Alvarez-Wyckoff experiment is this. At the time he undertook to study the film for us, Charles Wyckoff was unaware that there was anything unusual about frame 186 of the Zapruder film. He tentatively placed 1 shot there only because of Mr. Zapruder's slight jiggle at frame 190. Yet, in the Warren Commission report, we learn that, to a gunman tracking from the book depository, the President's head would have come into view for an instant through a hole in the foliage just at frame 186, where now appears something startled Abraham Zapruder. If a shot had been squeezed off there, a shot which missed, the length of time available to Oswald begins to stretch, even if the Commission's clock is right, for the Warren report placed the first shot at frame 210. But now that brings up a second question. Was the clock right? You'll recall that the Zapruder film is the basic clock for all of these events. Now, tests of the camera made by the FBI, a camera like this one, reported that it was running at an average speed of 18.3 frames per second. The camera had been obtained from the Bell & Howell Company, the manufacturers. During our CBS investigation, we asked the company if they had tested the camera speed. The result was a public announcement that they had tested it, and the result was the same as the FBI test. And the announcement continued that they had that day donated the camera to the National Archives, and this is it. But if the clock was not exactly right, then the whole sequence of events, from the number of shots to the time span of the shots and many other things, would be affected. Curiously, most of the critics themselves accepted the 18.3 speed without question, except one, who insists it was running at 24 frames, as could have happened if the control had been depressed. Now, we decided to see if we could clock the clock. We turned again to photo expert Charles Wyckoff.
We have a clock over here with a sweep-second hand, and if we photograph that clock with each one of these cameras, we will be able to measure the time that it takes to run through the few hundred frames as we've shown here. And I will try this for you right now. What I'll do is to turn the light on to illuminate the clock dial, start the camera, and then start the clock and let it run for about a 10 or 15 second period.
And you do that with each camera?
We do that with each camera, and then we take the film out, process it from each record, and we end up with a result very similar to what you see on this chart right here. This corresponds to the first camera. This is the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth. We started each frame here. We edited until we got the frame corresponding to 0 time on each one of the cameras. Then we counted off the same number of frames on each camera record that corresponded to frames 190 to 318 in the Zapruder record.
And there was this much difference in the cameras, although they were the same kind of cameras?
Same kind of cameras. There was this much difference in time. The first camera read 6.90 seconds, the second camera 7.30 seconds, the third 6.70, the fourth 8.35, and the last 6.16 seconds.
So under this theory, the shooter or shooters of the shots could have had up to how many seconds to fire?
They could have had, according to this, up as much as 8 3/35 of a second, which is a pretty long time.
In this hour, we have been considering the relationship between Oswald and the assassination. To the account given in the Warren Report, we have made 3 additions, each of which rests on evidence at least as persuasive as any provided by the Commission. Our analysis of the Zapruder film suggests strongly that the first shot was fired at frame 186. The Commission said only that the first shot to hit came between frames 210 and 225. Something startled Mr. Zapruder earlier, and the evidence is that a rifle shot was what startled him. We have shown that the Zapruder camera was quite possibly running slower than the Commission thought. The earlier shot and the slow camera together mean that the rifleman may have had additional time to get off 3 shots. We have shown by carefully controlled experiments that a Mannlicher Carcano rifle can be fired more rapidly and accurately than the Commission believed. Now, these points strengthen the Warren Report's basic finding. They make it more likely that Oswald shot the president. They significantly weaken a central contention of the critics, their contention that Oswald could not have done it because he did not have enough time to fire. It is now reasonable to assume that the first shot, fired through a tree, missed its mark, and that it was this shot that Governor Connolly heard. The governor has insisted all along that he was not struck by the first shot. It now appears he was correct. Now we can answer all our secondary questions. Did Oswald own a rifle? He did. Did Oswald take a rifle to the book depository building? He did. Where was Oswald when the shots were fired? In the building, on the 6th floor. Was Oswald's rifle fired from the building? It was. How many shots were fired? 3. How fast could Oswald's rifle be fired? Fast enough. What was the time span of the shots? 7 or 8 seconds. Did Lee Harvey Oswald shoot President Kennedy? CBS News concludes that he did.